Bench Opinions. Three idiots with amateur analysis.
Hello and welcome to Bench Opinions. Today, if you haven't heard the last podcast, then you will not have learned that Maxi is not with us. He is enjoying the sun in South Africa, so good for him. But we are going to continue with the rugby section of the show, and we are going to be talking about who we believe to have holistically the best rugby nation in the world. Obviously,
there's a pot and we're going to stir it.
Obviously, there's a pot and we're going to stir it. And obviously, there's a couple of front runners. I think our opinions might differentiate, but maybe we're on the same page. We'll see.
Yeah, I think it's important maybe to try and establish some sort of kind of metrics, or at least establish a way to kind of get to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, so to speak.
What would you like to suggest? World Cups.
Okay, the first one is World Cups, and I think that it's one of those that's so obvious and such low-hanging fruit, but extremely relevant at the same time.
Right.
So, World Cups. What country has won the most World Cups? Fantastic. I think then you should also look at population sizes as a metric and how much people do with that. If you then weigh that up to amount of World Cups, there might be another team that we could talk about.
Sure.
That could be maybe the better team because of that. Then I would say maybe the rugby pyramid as a whole in each country and the level at which rugby is played going down the ladder, I think is quite interesting. And I think those are the three main ones for me. I don't know if there's anything else you would maybe consider.
I mean, I don't know how much of an influence it should play, but we could talk about the culture of that sport within the country. How much of the population is behind that sport and sort of is sort of heavily invested in it. I think that could be quite an interesting one.
Yeah.
Would you like to, before we start debating, just off the top of your head, would you like to put your front runner out there?
Yeah, I would have to say New Zealand. Yeah.
You'd have to say New Zealand. Okay. For me, currently, the best holistic rugby nation would go to France.
Ooh.
So that's very interesting that neither of us picked South Africa.
No.
I thought one of us would, especially based on the World Cup.
Yeah, but I think there's very glaring, blatant reasons not to pick South Africa and why it's valid not to pick South Africa.
Right.
I'm surprised you picked France. I thought you would have picked Ireland because I think they are right up there, particularly when you're talking currently. I think for me, New Zealand might be not nostalgic, but might be a bit more of a nod to their continued dominance or continued presence in world rugby over the years, again and again and again with each generation they produce, which I don't think can be said for Ireland. I don't think it can be said for France, and I don't think it can be said for the Springboks.
Right.
I think there are years when the Springboks, well, they have been in the past years where the Springboks just haven't been anywhere near it in terms of winning World Cups. Of course, on your day, you can always maybe shock someone. And there have been generations or pockets of players that just haven't been as good as others. Whereas in New Zealand, there is a feeling, of course, they hold themselves to their own highest standards, but there is a feeling that they just get it right again and again and again.
Yeah.
But France is an interesting one to me, and particularly with the whole juxtaposition between the amount of World Cups that they have won, which is none, and and yet also the size of the population. You know, I look at Ireland and I'm like, okay, well, it's going to be hard, or it's going to be tougher to win World Cups. Maybe you could get a bit further than a quarterfinal, but win World Cups. Win World Cups if you just have a way smaller pool of players.
Of course. Besides the fact that Ireland's obviously, the Irish fans or not fans of this channel like to remind us that rugby is their fourth sport. So, that also plays an enormous role in the sense that they have even less players to pick from their already small pool. I think let's start with sort of franchise rugby and club rugby, and talk about the different nations. Would you like to start with New Zealand and their dominance or lack thereof?
Should we start at the right at the bottom?
Right at the bottom.
And for me, right at the bottom means schoolboy rugby.
Schoolboy rugby, okay.
So I checked the current Next Gen 15 rankings. And there's a good spattering of schools from all over the world, including Wales, obviously New Zealand, everyone. So it's a relatively well spread team list. But South African teams dominate with 5 out of the top 20.
Yeah, they do
being
extremely
South
well.
African. Paul Ruiz ranked highest.
Yeah.
Which
Grey
also surprised me.
College.
Gray was up there. Paul Jim was up there. Afis was in there.
Yeah.
So there's 5 schools. And I think it's hard to argue with the fact that South African schools probably on average are the best rugby schools in the world.
Yeah. I know which comments are going to come.
There is an asterisk though that I will put on it as well. And the asterisk that I will put on it is I don't think we have the squeakiest clean record when it comes to the use of drugs at schoolboy level.
Yeah.
And I think I'm happy to accept that.
Yeah.
Do I think that steroids are used at a schoolboy level? Yes. Do I think it's wide ranging? I don't know. I find it hard to prove. But I do 100% believe that our Springbok team is clean. So
yeah, that I believe as well. I think what you said is absolutely correct. I think it is actually quite wide ranging. I think it is quite scary, like the level that it's gone to. I've spoken with a couple of guys. There's a couple of guys here that have played schoolboy rugby in South Africa and also at a very high level, and they've told me stories where it's actually pretty shocking. These guys going into the changing rooms, sort of enhancing themselves. But at the same time, they also mentioned that don't be under any illusions that other nations aren't doing the same. Maybe not to the same degree, I don't think. But, you look at any competitive sport in the world and, whether it's Sinner in tennis accidentally rubbing steroid cream on his ankle to repair some stuff there.
Lance One Nut Armstrong.
Never having touched any substances, and then remembering actually no, he's been touching substances all his life. Any Russian athletes for that matter, it is just a very prevalent thing in professional sports, and so you cannot say that it's not happening in other nations as well.
Yeah, and then just to look at some of the other, I think the closest would be New Zealand teams, New Zealand rugby teams. I think there the asterisks possibly could be that a large number of particularly their schoolboy rugby players are not homegrown or wouldn't be considered homegrown. They really do help themselves to the Pacific Islands,
Polynesian countries. Yeah.
So that could be an asterisk for them, as an example. But I think it's hard to argue, and I think you have to, at some point, you have to just take things on face value. And the fact that there's 5 South African teams in the top 20 worldwide is pretty impressive.
And the New Zealand teams do extremely the New Zealand schools and their subsequent teams do extremely well as well. So in terms of schoolboy rugby, I'd have to give it to South Africa and New Zealand combined. I think it would be a fair assessment.
A close second, I would say. Yeah.
Also purely based on what we were talking about earlier on with nation sizes and populations. Obviously, New Zealand's significantly smaller than South Africa is. So to be able to field that many teams in the top 10 teams of schoolboy rugby is very impressive.
Yeah. Then I would say the next step up the ladder is probably club rugby.
Yeah.
I, to be honest, cannot assess that in the slightest.
So I watched... I think many people who watch our channel would have definitely heard or are also big fans of Squid Rugby. He, a couple of weeks ago, and this is actually what inspired me to want to have this conversation with you. A couple of weeks ago, he posted a video talking about French rugby as a whole. And then that's probably why I have this opinion that I think France has currently got holistically the best sort of rugby nation in the world. He went on to talk about how the system works in terms of how franchises and academies work in France. And it was very eye-opening. We've criticized the French a lot for sending like B-string sides down south in the summer, for us Europeans, summer season, and not like really respecting the opposition that they play against. And when you listen to the way that he explains it, there's a whole theory behind the madness, which is quite interesting. I'm digressing a little bit, but essentially the way that the French have revolutionized their club rugby is very impressive in the last 20, 25, 30 years. They have gotten serious private investment involved. The French are extremely rich, and individual billionaires essentially have decided, okay, no, football's a little bit too saturated. Let's start investing into rugby, see what we can do and how we can build up these teams. And they started with Toulon. I can't remember what the bloke's name is, but he started investing in Toulon. And I don't know if you remember, but Toulon had the likes of Bucky's Buerta, Brian Habana, O'Driscoll.
They very much started this wave of like this new era, I would say, in French rugby and rugby worldwide, where like getting superstars in meant a lot, and money spoke, because money didn't talk for a long time in rugby. I felt
exactly.
Yeah.
And so they started growing. He single-handedly started growing that club, right? Other billionaires started realizing like, oh, there's money to be made in rugby, and they started doing the same. And you sort of saw this entire league just grow. What inevitably happened is that, you know, you're bringing in all these players from around the world because you could afford to pay them, and the French rugby union was like, okay, well, what about our players? Like, we need to have a certain amount of players in our squads. And we spoke about this in yesterday's episode regarding academies and football. You know, you've got a quota where you've got to have a certain amount of homegrown players. You can't just, you know, buy up the whole world and fill your teams with those guys. And so the French rugby union did the same. They call them GIF, multitude of French words that I cannot pronounce or know the meaning of. But essentially, you'd have to have a certain amount of things that you sort of check off before you are qualified as a GIF player. So you have to, I think the one target is you have to have played in a French registered team for 5 years before the age of 21. The other one is you got to play in a French league before the age of 23 for 3 years, stuff like that. And then you qualify as a GIF registered player, and then you're allowed to play in any team in France, qualified as a GIF player. And I think so if you take Toulouse, for example, or Toulon, you have to field at least, I think it's like 70% have to be GIF registered players.
Okay, wow, yeah.
Which means France has to really invest in their academies.
Yeah.
And so that's what they do. They pump in a ton of money.
Yeah.
And then when they get to the development phase of these players, at, you know, when they're sort of 18, 19, 20, they start loaning them out to different clubs so that they get first-hand experience. So when you've got guys going down to where they go last year, this year they're going down to New Zealand, right?
Yeah, this year they're going to New Zealand.
When they're going down to New Zealand, these guys have played in the French league.
Yeah.
Like the top 14. They've played there for like the last 2 years before they go down to New Zealand to then, you know, get their first cap. So they're playing at an extremely high level, come back to France, already have their first 3, 4, 5 caps. By the time they get, you know, put on the bench for home games or big games like in the World Cup, these guys have already amassed a number of caps.
Yeah.
So that whole system is really interesting.
So they've created a clear pathway.
Absolutely.
I think, and then judging off the back of that, I think it would be hard to argue with the fact that French club rugby is probably not one of the strongest. I think you could probably make
it is the strongest.
Yeah. Sorry, is the strongest. If you look at, surely England is up there, I think, because they just have such a strong club culture. I think that's what you need as well. You know,
but their league isn't very good.
No,
the Premier League is pretty low in terms of quality.
Yeah, that's true. I think club rugby is so unique in that you maintain the level of club rugby by having healthy clubs. It sounds so stupid, but at an amateur level, if clubs are not healthy, you know, like South Africa, I think struggles with this. I think, you know, my dad used to speak to me about country clubs back in the day being the nucleus of every single town in South Africa. You know, everything happened around the country club, whether you know, were bowls, tennis, golf. And as those die, you know, as those structures die. I mean, in Germany, we have the same thing with Vereine. They're just so well funded, they're so well supported, and they're such a core part of the community. That's why I think my mind would tell me that club rugby in England, for example, where there's a strong club culture, Scotland as well, where there's a strong culture around clubs and having local community teams.
Yeah.
And then I would say almost Ireland as well. And I would say Ireland to a certain degree, particularly also because their two main sports are amateur sports as well, that even there, I think, obviously at the end of the day, you have to choose between which sport you play, but rugby's become increasingly popular in Ireland.
Yeah.
It's the one professional sport, and with their clubs having such strong foundations, with their two main sports being Gaelic football and what's the other one? Hurling. I would think Irish teams and Irish clubs at club level are also healthy and doing pretty well.
Well, one hand feeds the other, right? If your national team is doing well, then suddenly there's an interest that rises for your franchises, which in turn means more funding, better training for your players. They then play better when they go up to national level. So it's a bit of a cycle.
Yeah.
What do you think about South Africa and their franchises?
I think
because we do quite well in the URC, for example.
Yeah.
Last year we made it to the semi-finals with the Bulls.
Exactly, yeah.
We won the first URC with the Stormers.
Yeah.
This year we're looking pretty solid with two teams in the top 4.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to judge the franchises currently, or it may be a bit harsh to judge them now because of the massive shifts in the dynamic of rugby in worldwide, and also for South Africa now having to adapt to the new schedule. Or schedule, whichever way you say it. But I think you have to. It's harsh, and I think we've indirectly criticized them for their approach to the Champions Cup and the European Championship. So I think, I think there's some work to do there. But I think if you look back down the years, outside of the Crusaders' dominance, South Africa performed extremely well in Super Rugby.
Yeah.
The teams were always up there. They were always performing well. And I think franchise rugby is really healthy in South Africa with the viewership numbers. Even in stadiums like Western Province, not Western Province, the Stormers, them filling out Cape Town Stadium most of the time. And
they've got the highest attendance of any team in the URC this year.
And I think that speaks volumes for the work our franchise teams do. I think Loftus also always has good visitorship. Kings Park Stadium as well.
Also very good, yeah.
Yeah, Ellis Park, whatever. That's another story for another day. But there's multitude of reasons why that doesn't work. But yeah, I think as a whole, franchise rugby is really healthy in South Africa. But they're going to have to, in the next 3 to 4 years, start becoming competitive in all the competitions they're in. I think to make a big shout for the crown of the best.
We have a very mixed approach in franchise rugby in South Africa due to when you look at ownership. So Western Province or the Stormers, they currently own 100% of the team or of the union.
It belongs to the union, yeah.
And then you have the likes of like the Cheetahs, where half of it or a third of it belongs to Supersport. The Lions, 70% of it belongs to one company.
Yeah.
I can't even remember what the company's name is. The Bulls is also something similar like that. And then you have the Sharks, where 51% belongs to Rock Nation.
Yeah.
So it's very varying approaches to how that franchise system is owned and funded. But it just doesn't seem like, besides Rock Nation, it doesn't seem like the other investors in these franchises are pumping money into it.
I think it's also, though, again, I think it also is just a mirror of the current state of change in the landscape and where South African franchises fit in the global sense. I think for a long period of time, I think a lot of people that invest heavily in rugby would have felt like a bit of an experiment. There was definitely not the same finality you've had the last 2 years in the first few years of URC rugby. I think people that were in the know knew that this is probably the long-term plan. But I think if you're pumping a lot of money into something, I think you wanted to see that if it can work or not. And I think maybe that period of due diligence is now done, and you might see more Rock Nations. And we've had the attempt already by international investors coming into SA Rugby. Or at least the attempt to do it. So
MVM,
I think the trends are there that more and more people are going to try and get a piece of the pie.
Yeah. Okay, so we've spoken about schoolboy rugby. We gave that one to South Africa. With New Zealand being a close second, we've now spoken about the franchise level rugby, I think we're giving that one to France.
Yeah.
With an Ireland probably being like a close second in that regard.
Yeah. Look, I do want to make a distinction though, just briefly on franchise and club, because I think club rugby is the amateur part of what you can maybe pull into. No, just amateur rugby at a senior level in these countries. And that's what I meant by this whole club structure and clubs being healthy. And someone like Ireland having a strong amateur sport base, I think that aids you in having better teams, because the bigger the community that surrounds a club, the more likelihood there are to be people that send their kids there to play rugby. They themselves play rugby there and stuff like that. I think there, France and Ireland are streaks ahead. And I would think not the professional league, but I would think club rugby in countries like England and Scotland as well, where there is a strong club culture, would also be pretty healthy and pretty good. But I would still give it in that order. I would say France and Ireland, I think, would probably be ahead in terms of club amateur rugby, but amateur senior rugby, and then the next level I would say is franchise rugby, which we spoke about now as well. Whereas I think France and Ireland, I think, are still the people that are ahead there. I think England, if you look at the league from the outside in and on the surface, it looks quite healthy. If you look at the kind of players that are playing at these teams, they don't have maybe the international star power, but the teams, if you look at the stadium they play in, and I think everything, the whole package looks pretty interesting. But if you start to chip away at the seams, I think it's quite brittle. A lot of the clubs are in big financial issues.
It definitely is quite brittle. I think we discussed it a couple of months ago, where the Premier League was trying to force South Africa out of the URC and then sort of take over the URC. I think you're spot on there. If you start chipping away at the paint, there's some real structural integrity that's not looking so good.
Exactly. So there, I would say that kind of puts them a little bit out of the running, because you kind of question, how is that possible? So there must be something going wrong there. And then we have to talk about what used to be the two other franchises in Super Rugby, or the two groups of franchises in Super Rugby, right. New Zealand and Australia. I think Australia are so far behind it. I think they're trying to rectify a lot of what has gone wrong, but
some of their teams are not doing too badly in the Super Rugby currently. I can't remember who exactly it is. It's definitely not Western Force.
They don't exist anymore. They've gone bust. But I think
that's what I'm saying.
I think Waratahs and Brumbies tend to just have good sides.
Yeah.
And then the Rebels were around for a while, but they seem to blow hot and cold. But I think definitely Waratahs and Brumbies tend to produce good players.
Yeah.
But they were, bar one or two seasons, even in the old format of Super Rugby, they did tend to be behind South Africa and New Zealand. You had the one dream year for the Reds with Quade Cooper and Will Genia.
Yeah,
that was the dream team that year, and they managed to win it, the Reds, out of nowhere. But other than that, you had decent Brumbies sides and decent Waratah sides, but generally speaking, it was either a New Zealand or a South African team winning.
Yeah,
and New Zealand, I think, is just so hard to judge right now, because they've got quality sides. Their franchises are good
for sure,
but it seems to be happening in a bit of a vacuum.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move over to the national sides of these countries, and I'd like to include under 19 World Cups as well.
Okay, yeah.
Because that's just part of the whole national setup.
Yeah.
And maybe later on we can also, as a little joker, we can talk about sevens.
Which is
which I'll include in the section of culture.
Yeah.
Right? Obviously, you can't look past the fact that South Africa has 4 World Cups, and from most of the nations has only been eligible to play the least amount of World Cups. Next, you would have New Zealand with 3.
Yeah.
And then you have England with 1. So my whole theory on France goes out of the window in terms of World Cup successes.
Yeah. Yeah. Here you have to then obviously also then again separate what's been and what is now currently relevant. As I think New Zealand just on this level just gets so many plaudits because they're always there. They go into every single World Cup as favorites or shared favorites. They don't very rarely exit the competition outside of the semi-finals. I think South Africa has been in 4 finals, won 4.
Yeah.
New Zealand's been in, they were in the last final with us and lost, and they were in the final of 95, they lost, so could it look very different.
And then won 3 themselves, so they've been in at least 5. I don't know if they've been in another one.
Yeah. I don't think
Who
so.
did England beat?
Australia.
Was it Australia?
Because it was hosted in Australia
Oh,
as
sorry,
well.
we forgot about Australia's also won a World Cup.
Australia's also won a World Cup, yeah.
Who did they play in the World Cup final?
France.
Was it France?
Yeah, France made it to that final. And France had a really good habit across the years of getting quite deep into World Cup competitions, even though they didn't always have the best teams on paper per se. France generally tended to rise to the occasion of...
Wasn't France also in the final in 2007
Yes.
when we played them?
No, we beat England.
Was it England?
We beat England in that final.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
My bad.
So England also always showing up, actually.
Yeah, 2019, they're also in the finals.
Exactly. So it could all look very different, but I think you have to get it across the line, and that says a lot about South African rugby and how good it is. And I think few would argue with South Africa being up there.
It's interesting that South Africa, we didn't put the franchises and the club team up at the top of the pile, and yet at a national level they perform very well, which is strange. Is that due to coaching? Is that due to...
I mean, when you mentioned you wanted to talk about this leading up to this episode, I thought about it a lot, and I looked at trying to understand what approach might be better. A shallower approach in the way things work. So I see Ireland, for example, and New Zealand as very shallow approaches to having the best possible national team. And I say that in the sense that in Ireland, the Irish Rugby Union has a lot of control and seems to have their fingers in a lot of how things work. Mm-hmm. With one goal of trying to feed and structure the whole system in a way as to prop up the national side. And the same thing happens in New Zealand. New Zealand even go as far as to sign all their players to central contracts, and in some cases even decide which unions they end up playing for, and try and spread All Black players across the unions as equally as possible for the health of the league, which is an interesting approach. I don't know which is better or what is worse. But then, and I would let's call that, for the sake of this, a shallow approach, right? And then I would argue South Africa and France have maybe a less shallow approach, a deeper approach, how do you call it? Deep. I would call it deep for the sake of this podcast. Whereas, sure, let's try and give the unions as much tools as possible, but I would say, other than Russie's changed that a little bit now, I think, to our benefit. Don't get involved too heavily in trying to determine what the unions do. Create an atmosphere where there's as much competition as possible. These unions are incentivized to churn out as much talent as possible. And then you go in and make sure that at the national level, once they enter the national level setup, the infrastructure is there to make sure that the team's good as possible. And I see France and South Africa having more similarities there than the shallower approach of Ireland and New Zealand. And that's what I would say now in terms of why maybe I don't see South Africa being on par with Ireland and France, even though I've put France and South Africa in the same sort of deep approach. But particularly when it comes to South Africa, I'd say that's the reason maybe why I wouldn't rank the franchises as high at this stage, is because, it is a bit of a free-for-all. And now, particularly in this new phase of them trying to get used to the whole URC setup alongside the Springbok setup, and players having to kind of still fit into Rassie's plans, but try and cope with the new playing schedule. That's why I think maybe they're suffering at the moment, and that's why they've fallen down the rankings.
I like your the way that you phrased it. It's like deep approach, because it also goes hand in hand with how many players Erasmus used last year, which was, I think, 53 or 52. I can't remember exactly what the number was. And we were all very impressed by that, and still being able to have a 87% win ratio. I think we only lost 2 games, and even those 2 games are extremely close. And so, you're just building on this depth, which that's why I think the deep part is so interesting. And at the time, I always thought, I was like, no other nation is doing this. In comes France. Yeah. You know that they played with 75 players last year.
Crazy. Yeah.
So and another 22, 23 players more, like a full squad, more than what we used. And they also had a very successful year, which also brings up the topic of, for them, 6 nations, for us and for New Zealand, Rugby Championships. Obviously, Rugby Championships has been dominated by the All Blacks for a very long time. South Africa is starting to perform much better in those. Yeah. which would mean that the current Springbok team is also very high on the list in terms of like us picking the nation of or the best in international rugby. But then you look at the French side for Six Nations. They obviously won this year. You could argue it was quite close, but except for their brain fart that they had against England, they were pretty dominant, right?
Yeah.
And they have been pretty dominant. I think they haven't fallen lower than second or third place for like the last 6 years.
Exactly.
So they've been right up there, if not winning the entire time.
But I think it's also, if you look, it's no coincidence that we're talking about two very big countries with large populations. So France has 80 million, I think, something like that, similar population to Germany, and South Africa has around 60 million. I think also the ability to control such vast rugby playing structures is difficult. And that's why you tend to give it the sort of capitalist free market approach of saying, go wild, do your thing, and we'll try and make sure that we know how to turn whatever's being churned out at lower level into the best possible rugby team representing the nation. Whereas in Ireland and New Zealand, you could argue that it's so enticing, for them to be able to control things because it's a smaller setup.
Part,
that control allows them to kind of try and look at the sum of the parts and say this is how we get to creating the best national team. And I would argue that over the years, as that has gotten more prevalent in Irish rugby, it's benefited them. The Irish team has gotten better because of the centralized way of doing things. And I think also then you look at how they pool resources in order to make that happen. And within Irish rugby have a certain way of funneling players up from, let's say, an Ulster into a Leinster eventually, or whatever, or having a certain amount of marquee players in each union. I don't think that would be possible in South Africa. Having said that, though, and I touched on this, I think the fact that Rassi's been able to find a strange middle ground, because if you think back to the days of your Heineke Meyers, Alistair Coetzee, etc., what I often found was what was happening is players were performing really well at a franchise level, and you could almost not get away with not picking them. Like, you have to pick them. I really do think of people like Zane Kirshner, for example. And he on the face of it, in a performing Bulls side, he was a good fullback. But as soon as he got into the South African setup, there was just no way in hell he was good enough, I would argue. And
I couldn't stand him.
Yeah, of course. And
I was so nervous every time he got the ball.
I think the general consensus is that no one felt that he was ever rose to the occasion of being in a Springbok shirt. But Rassi's kind of found a way to bridge that. And I think that's why South Africa maybe has celebrated more success. And by the sounds of it, with this whole GIF program that France have developed, they also have found a way to exercise the right amount of control, at least when players fall into their sphere of control when it's international rugby time.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think these teams have come to the fore in recent times. I have to say, though, if France don't win a World Cup pretty soon, I think you're going to struggle to really keep talking. They're going to have to get some success.
Well, let's talk about the culture aspect. So, sorry, just before we move on, who are we giving the win to on the nation side?
Oh, it's so difficult because of past and present. And
for me, it kind of sounds like currently it has to be between South Africa and France.
Yeah, currently. I think New Zealand can't be ignored. I really don't.
But we're talking about currently.
Yeah. It's hard. I would say currently South Africa, and that's only because of the World Cups and 2 World Cups in a row. I think if you do that, and the rugby championships that we've won.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I'm happy to go either way.
Yeah.
I'm sort of on the fence with that one. So if we'll go with South Africa on that one. Let's talk about the culture aspect, because you're talking about, like, if France doesn't win in the next couple years, what does that do in terms of their fans maybe losing interest? Because currently France is a very interesting case where the viewership that they're getting for their rugby has risen above the viewership that they're getting for their football.
Yeah.
Which cannot be said for many nations in the world.
No. And I touched on this when we spoke about it in a previous episode, that I think nothing really happens by accident in the world we live in. I think particularly in major sporting codes and stuff. It's a slow machine that churns and moves, and trends tend to emerge. And I think it's not by accident that the fact that France is seeing really big investment in rugby across the board. The team has become more competitive on an international level, is churning out large amounts of international rugby players, is leading to viewership, while that coincides with football in France really struggling, having one dominating power in PSG, a lot of teams having massive financial difficulties. I don't think any of that's by accident. So I think that's kind of, that's telling. So that shows a shift towards rugby becoming... And we've been to Toulouse. You walk through Toulouse, and the amount of scarves and everything you see is really crazy.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the whole south of France is pretty rugby nuts, which is, for us as rugby fans, is obviously cool to see. But if you walk through South Africa, it's no different. If it's Springbok season, international rugby season, we've got, what's it called? Springbok Fridays? No, what's it called?
Yeah, exactly.
Springbok Fridays or something like that. So everybody rocks up with their Springbok jerseys, or at least something green.
Yeah.
There is. It's hard to argue that there's as big a culture as in South Africa when it comes to being rugby mad. I mean, I think New Zealand. I've never been to New Zealand, but I think New Zealand would be similar.
They say it's like a religion there. Yeah, for example, and also particularly with and I don't know, we're separating union from league because neither of us know a thing about league and it doesn't interest us, but you can't also forget how crazy big rugby league is in New Zealand as well.
Absolutely.
So if you're not watching union, you're watching league.
Yeah.
And most people play and watch both. In Australia, it's even crazier. The league is probably one of the most, after Australian football is.
That's probably the biggest sport after that. Yeah.
Sport. Yeah. So,
I mean, we're talking about like people are showing up to schoolboy rugby. Schoolboy rugby is being televised. I don't know about New Zealand, but in South Africa, it's definitely being televised. Schoolboy teams are being sponsored by all sorts of different companies. It's a massive thing, and people go and watch.
Yeah, and 95 just can't be ignored. And I think that might have been by accident in the sense that it was the perfect timing. But since 95 and the role it's played in trying to unify the nation and succeeding in unifying the nation, and the emergence of personalities like Siya Kolisi, and essentially, I wouldn't say erasing, but when people watch rugby, it's one of the few times that people watch just because they're supporting their country in South Africa.
Yeah.
And because of that, just the pure power and pull of that is insane. And I think unfairly, a lot of other countries just can't match that because they just haven't gone through what South Africa's gone through. But if you look at South African cricket, for example, there's never ever a game where there's not some sort of discussion about quotas or colour or some political nonsense. And rugby is just not the case. It's one of the few sporting codes in South Africa where that kind of seems to get thrown out the window and unifies. So I think it's hard. It's unfair, but it's hard to see a country coming close in terms of culture when it comes to rugby and what it means to people.
One thing that South African rugby culture doesn't compete at as well as other nations is currently is rugby sevens.
Yeah.
Our team has fallen from grace a little bit. There you have the likes of an Argentina that is dominating. You have the likes of France that's doing extremely well. And then New Zealand also never goes away. Obviously you have in the past have had a team like Fiji who's been unreal, and you could argue, well, I'm just going to claim it's their national sport is rugby sevens.
Yeah, that's just, I would say that Fiji is the best sevens nation ever.
Right. The other thing that South Africa doesn't do well at, in terms of looking at it holistically, is we don't perform very well in our women's side. Yeah. Where if you look at, I think England is the top performing female squad in the world. Yeah. And that also in sevens, the Australian women's side is extremely good there. So there are other nations where, they may be not as dominant in the males side of the sport, but the female side is doing extremely well, and vice versa when it comes to 15s and sevens rugby.
Yeah. Yeah, look, for me, and I think it's obviously also a sentimental thing, because I think the most subjective element of this whole conversation is the culture thing, because we're wrapped up in it. And for me, South Africa is a clear winner. Again, but for me, with an asterisk, just because of history, and it's just the other countries can't compete.
Right.
With what's gone on and what role rugby's played.
So Dominic, now we've had this discussion. We've put it in 4 different categories: culture, national team, franchise and unions, club rugby, and grassroots level. We have no clear winner, it seems. South Africa has come out on top more often than not, which neither of us had predicted at the beginning.
Yeah.
Would you now put them on top after the discussion?
The reason I wouldn't put them on top as clear winners is because of the 2 asterisks that I mentioned. The schoolboy rugby steroid situation. I think it's just an asterisk that's, even though a lot of other schools might be doing okay, but I know what's going on. We know what's gone on in the past. And I just think it would be naive and ignorant to just be like, can't ignore that. So and then the second one is just history played its role in shaping rugby as being this crazy cultural phenomenon in South Africa. And I think because it happened by accident, Nelson Mandela will claim that it wasn't by accident. He knew what he was doing, and I think he did. But the fact that the chance presented itself in such a way, and the fact that South Africa managed to get to that final and win that final in 95, even though a lot of people would confirm that they were not the favorites and they shouldn't have actually won that World Cup coming into that World Cup. I think the stars aligned.
We got lucky with France not forfeiting that one game in the rain.
Exactly.
Which would have otherwise kicked us out of the tournament.
Yeah, exactly. So, so I think because of that, because the stars aligned and because kind of none of the other countries really are at fault, that asterisk is quite strong for me as well.
Right.
So I hate to do this because I hate sitting on fences because it hurts, but especially for extended periods of time. Yeah. But surely at the moment, if you're looking at the 2 countries that are driving the sport of rugby, followed closely by the third, it would be France and South Africa, and then Ireland.
Okay. That's a statement.
It is a statement. And I apologize to the New Zealanders.
Because you had selected them and now you've just dropped them like a bag of...
Yeah, but sometimes you work through issues, and as you work through issues, you realize, okay, maybe it is me.
Yeah.
And in this case, look, it's so hard not to say New Zealand as well, though. But for me, New Zealand is a little bit of a nostalgic pick, but because of I know how big the sport is.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not going to call it unfair with how it seems like Australia and New Zealand have been a little bit cast outwards of the global rugby thing, but they're very much at fault for alienating South Africa to a certain degree.
Yeah.
But it is hard. It's hard. It's hard to judge New Zealand, and it's not going to get easier with France sending a second string side, no matter how good that second string side is in June and July now. And you would think that it might get to a point where obviously rugby championship will be a good sign. But you'd think that if it continues this way and the Super Rugby doesn't grow in any sort of direction, that New Zealand's only going to really have a chance to prove themselves every 4 years at the World Cup.
And the Rugby Championship.
But then you'll have, the Irish and the rest of the world saying, yeah, but we're not in it. So
yeah. Or unless this World Club League thing actually goes through, which would be quite interesting to see. I mean, I'd love to see...
Who's your pick?
Well, I picked France originally, and I'm going to stick with France because I've got principles. No, I'm joking.
That's fine.
No, look, the statement that you made right at the end in terms of which nation is pushing rugby forward the most, that flipped it for me because in terms of club rugby, I mean, you can't argue. Top 14 is
for sure.
the best league to be in, right?
Heads and shoulders above everyone else.
But in terms of national team, story, culture, you can't argue South Africa away. So, it's got to be between those 2 teams. And then, don't get me wrong, France is an incredible rugby side as well.
Yeah.
And then you've got Ireland and New Zealand that are, it's so close. Let's be honest, rugby is at the most healthiest it's ever been.
And then I would say the biggest thing that overhangs us is the fact that New Zealand and Ireland, with their population size,
minuscule in comparison,
and the dominance of other sports, rugby league included, in a place like New Zealand, for them to still be in the conversation is miraculous. And one could argue bumps them ahead of both of France and South Africa. Consider if you look at resources
Ireland as well, then,
versus output, exactly.
Yeah. Well, there you have it. We've had a conversation for half an hour, and we are none the wiser.
Nobody wins.
We are a little bit wiser.
Nobody wins as long as everybody has fun.
It would be really interesting to us if you comment down below and tell us which nation you think is the top nation, not national team, nation, when it comes to rugby. We think that would be quite an interesting conversation to have with you in the comments. So please like and subscribe and let us know your thoughts.
Goodbye.
Ciao.